So Jim Tognolini is, well, as you may have read from his profile, he's an incredibly impressive man who's done some amazing things in the world of education and assessment. Most notably, of course, is his years with Pearson and the work that he does at the Center for Educational Measurement and Assessment. And he has also done some work for IDAT, helping us to complete our quality review last year. So we're very pleased to have him here today to talk to us about modern assessment theory. So thank you very much, Jim. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Heidi. And hello, everybody. I'm sorry about that. I kind of got a bit lost getting into the system. So let's hope I don't get lost on the way through modern assessment theory. Okay, so what I intend to do, if we got 45 minutes here for the total,
yes.
Does that include question time?
Plus question time. Okay.
Right, so what I'm going to do today is just quickly go through what I call modern assessment theory, which is the way we tend to think about assessment these days, and then you can, you know, kind of link it to where you are in your neck of the woods, wherever you are around the world or whatever, and see whether you apply it already, or it fits into your context, or you see something that's quite useful and you might like to read a bit more about, etc. But it is an important area, assessment, and therefore we've had a conversation going for a long while right around the world on this idea of what I call modern assessment theory. So I'm going to start with the definition of assessment, and then work from there to talk to you about how this might play out in your daily work and in the way you use examinations and tests. So assessment, and it took us a long time to come up with this definition, and it's quite an interesting exercise. We've been starting up a discussion here about, let's talk about these terms, let's share our understanding of them. And if I'm in a room and I ask people to define assessment, everybody's got a different view, but everybody, when they say the word, just think everybody's saying the same thing. It's quite a really good way to start and get a shared understanding of something that's a critical part of teaching and learning. So to us, it involves professional judgment. There's no doubt about it that assessment involves professional judgment. And what it is, it's professional judgment based on an image of a student formed by the collection of information about their performance. And it took us a number of years to work out this definition, because we're trying to replicate what teachers actually do. And eventually came to this idea that all testing, all assessment is professional judgment. Even if it's a standardized test, somebody's made a decision, I'll put this question in and this one not in, and so on. So there's some key points in there. The notion of professional judgment, the notion of collection of image, don't go yet. Thank you. Professional judgment, building an image, and so on. And if you start with that concept about building an image and our definition of assessment, you can think, well, that means teachers collect information about students in a number of ways. Up the right-hand end of this line, you can see examinations, standardized tests like the IDAT test, published aptitude tests, etc., are really structured ways of collecting information about students, but they're not the only way. You have classroom tests, checklists, practical work, project work, etc. And down further, you know, we all know now that probably the most common way of collecting information about students is through observing them. You watch them, and that bit of information that you get goes into your mind. Oh, that student did that, was I expecting that, and so on. So you can see that teachers use a range of ways of collecting information about students. I want to stress that right-hand end, because a lot of people see that is the only way. And that's not how I think about it. The tests like IDAT, etc., are one more piece of information, but what they do is they confirm, hopefully, what you already have from the rest of your information. And it's a critical part of the testing process to get outside data, prepared differently, and is it giving me the same image that I had Is it confirming the image that I have from my observation from a classroom test or from what I've got from another school where they've been tested there? It's the difference that's important, not the score per se. Okay, thanks, Heidi. So if I look at, you know, I just want to finish that definition part by saying, if you think like this, then you can see straight away that there is a difference between terms that people commonly use. You know, assessment does not equal testing. Testing is one way you collect information. It's just one of the ways. Measurement doesn't equal testing, and it doesn't equal assessment. Measurement is the process of giving a number to indicate how much numeracy, how much literacy, how much empathy a particular student has. So it's a way of summarising it in terms of what we call a developmental continuum, which I'll talk about in a minute. Evaluation doesn't equal assessment, and it doesn't equal testing, it doesn't equal measurement. They're different terms, and we've got to share that understanding with each other. Evaluation is where you take the image formed by all that information that you've collected about students. You take the image and you give it a value judgment. You say it's an A, or it's a 95, or it's a very good, or good. You put a value judgment on the image, and therefore, you know, it doesn't equal assessment. So one of the things, as I said, about modern assessment theory, we want people to share, to discuss, to talk about these terms, get a shared understanding and educate their communities. This is how it all fits together. It's not, you know, teach, assess. It's actually assessment's part of the whole process. Thank you, Heidi. Yeah, and there are just some more terms there. A test item to us is the basic unit and so on. I want to go on to one of the critical parts of our definition, which is the concept of an image. And I said to you, teachers build images of what students know and can do, and it's all based upon the information they collect. It's really interesting, you know, that if you think about it, you know, if I ask teachers generally, you know, can you tell me what you know about this student? Everybody goes and gets their marks put and puts a mark in front of me. Well, that mark doesn't really tell me much about the student. But, and you know, and you say to them, look, I don't want to see marks. I want you to tell me about this student. And really they say, I can't until I do a test. But then I watch these teachers and I talk to them, and I watch them, and when they do a test and they give the result back to the student, they say, that's really good for you. You've done really well here, or you haven't done well. So in other words, even though they give a test and they've got a number, they still subconsciously compare it to what they've got in their head. But they're a bit loath to use what they've got in their head as the driving force. They want the numbers. So the whole notion of images and use of data is critical to the teaching learning process. When you get results back from a test like IDAT, the number by itself is just one bit of information. It's really got to be taken into account. And it's the difference between that bit of information about the student in that context and what I expect from all the other information that is the powerful piece of that particular test and any other test. Every bit of information. You watch a student in a playground, or the student comes up to you and says, sir, I was reading this book. And you think, you were reading a book? It doesn't look like that. But you actually think, gee, that's strange. I didn't know that kid could read that well. So you watch the student a bit more. This is what assessment is. It's teaching and learning, really. It's hard to distinguish between them. It's part of our consciousness all the time. So the image is critical to the whole notion of modern assessment theory. And I didn't make this up. I mean, I just worked this out from talking to teachers how they do it. So it's not a new idea. Okay, next one. Thank you. I think it's important then, if we're talking about assessment and the value of assessment, it is important to understand what marks mean. And to be honest, I've got to say this, you know, that a mark by itself doesn't mean much at all. You know, if somebody says, if my daughter came home and said, Dad, I got 88 on a maths test, 88 on a maths test, you know, my immediate reaction is, well, I guess yours would be too, to try and get a handle on what that means. What does an 88 mean? And you say, well, the first question should be asking is 88 out of what? Otherwise, I don't know what it means. You know, 88 on an SAT is 88 out of 500. That's not that good. 88 out of 50 is pretty good. 88 out of 88 is good. But everybody immediately thinks it's 88 out of 100. But we need that bit of extra information to be able to focus and give that mark a meaning. So we asked that. The next question we're going to ask is, what was the average? Because if the average was 90, it was a very easy test bet by the teacher or whatever, then 88 isn't that good, and so on. So you know that. So the one thing we have to remember is that marks by themselves have no meaning. We have to give them meaning by referencing the mark to something. When you take your class average, you reference it to the group. The problem with referencing it to the group is you could have a specialist group. You've got a top group of students, and comparing that to the top group, that's a little bit mean, because if you put them into a normal group, they'd probably be way near the top. In a top group, they could be down the bottom. So, just using that way as a way of referencing information, which we call norm referencing, isn't that valuable, really. It actually, the other thing is, it tells us nothing about what the student can do. An 88, if I get a mark of 88, it doesn't say what I can do or what I can't do. It just says where I am. And then if I put the class average in, it says where I am relative to this group. I don't know how good the group is. So we might need that sometimes and get that normative information, but it's not that valuable. And most systems around the world then have said that. An 88 doesn't tell students much at all. But if you think what we said originally, teachers have all this information in their head. It's like me trying to get it out of that teacher. Can you tell me what the student knows and can do? So we have to move from just getting marks and giving them meaning by comparing them to, what everybody else got, and try and capture that image. And over the years, we've looked at what we call criterion referencing, where you kind of put all these criteria down and say, this person's demonstrated this 5 times, therefore they've got that behaviour and that behaviour linked to behavioural objectives. That was far too atomized. Teachers got tied up at ticking and crossing and doing all sorts of things in the classroom. To us, it wasn't much value. But we went further. We've now said, well, let's try and capture that image. Can I write descriptions of what a top student, the sorts of things a top student can do? How about the sorts of things the next level student can do? So we try and write descriptions of what people know and can do, going from relatively low to relatively high performance levels. And then we ask the teachers to compare the image, which of these descriptions best fits the image that you've got from all the information you've got. Now, we call that standards referencing, and it's a system that's not only here, but it's done right around the world now, because it's starting to try and capture that image. And when you start talking about the image, as I said, you can say, well, they did this, and this is what I've got from this information, but on that particular test, they did that. So it gives us something to talk about for reporting purposes and for teaching and learning, and not just ranking the child. So there's a lot of work being done on that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Critical to the whole idea of standards and standards referencing and assessment to us is the notion of a developmental continuum. We have, if you think of it like this, that effectively a child's on a journey, and what we have to do is track them where they are on that journey. And how do we do that? We collect information, go back to our definition of assessment, build the image, and we track them. How far are they? Are they close to that city there or whatever? And we call that a developmental continuum. And it attempts to capture in words what it means to make progress, grow or improve in an area of learning or a domain of knowledge. So there's the next critical part to our definition of assessment. Assessment to us, and why we think of this as new, is assessment to us now is viewed as the process of monitoring a child's progress or development along a developmental continuum. I'll show you how to do that, etc. in a moment. But again, I want you to think, if you think about your own assessment, what you're doing now, you basically do this. But if you start to think like that, if you're just starting, then you know, it's a really powerful way to go. And if you're already doing it, the question is, how do you track them? And how do you record that? How do you report that? And that's what we talk about modern assessment theory. It opens up the whole spectrum of things. So assessment is now viewed by us as monitoring a child's progress along a developmental continuum. The focus has shifted from one of comparing each student with another, where they are in the group, towards describing what they know they can do. And the modern assessment theory is based on the whole notion of growth. And some of the stuff you might read in the literature is on progressions, etc. Mark Wilson in the US and the Bear Group. There's a whole pile of people working on progressions. It's all predicated on this theory. Knowledge and skill than they had previously. So further to the right indicates that. And the aim for you, me, the student, the parents, everybody, is to help that student move along that line. You know, traditionally, teachers just thought they were the ones that could help them. Everybody can if you make it explicit about what children have to do to grow. So if you start with this basic concept of growth, and you think of mathematics, we could say the whole, if we put all the subjects on there and imagine we have a continuum starting in the middle there, which is at 0, which right in the axis there means that's the point the child has no knowledge, no understanding, or knows nothing about maths or science, social science or geography or science, whatever. As they get to know more, as they start to learn mathematics, so they start to move along those developmental continua there, and you can start to track them. The question is, when do they know nothing? I ask that question in lectures, and I say, well, when is it the child knows nothing? A lot of people answer and say, well, it's the day they're born. Some people, you know, challenge that, of course, because 3 months before they're born, children start to demonstrate they have knowledge in the womb, etc. So the whole notion about when it starts, it's the point where they've got none. By the way, when I ask secondary teachers when they know, you know, when does the child know mathematics, they tell me that's the day they come to secondary school, and they pick them up there. The tertiary university lecturers tell me it's the day they come to uni. So everybody just keeps teaching the students the same thing rather than saying, well, they do know something, how much do they, am I going to build on it? So it's quite an interesting concept, but you can see how it's done. The next slide says, although I can do this and track children in science, mathematics, English, art, whatever, I can also do it in constructs which we call non-cognitive in a lot of places, the empathy, well-being, engagement, whatever you like, critical thinking. At our university, we're grappling with cultural competence, inventiveness or creativity, and so on, digital literacy. The concept's the same. I've got to find out how much digital literacy, skill, knowledge, experience, attitudes, whatever they are measuring, I've got to find how much they've got and be able to track them to show that my teaching is having an impact along that, you know, on that particular construct. So the next slide gives an example of what I'm talking about. So in primary mathematics, you can imagine, therefore, if there's my developmental continuum going from lower to higher, then you could think somebody just starting off down the left-hand end of mathematics, you know, what are the sorts of things they know and can do? It's probably in your curriculum. things like counting to 30, orders, reads, and represents numbers in the range 0 to 20, and so on. People who demonstrate that, who give me evidence they can do that, say, well, they're about here on the line. And what do I have to do to get them to the next stage? Well, the next stage there, counts, orders, reads, etc., shows growth. Students who count, order, read, and represent 2- and 3-digit numbers should say, well, they're further along the line because they've got more of this knowledge. And by the way, they should be able to do the previous one. And up further along the line, orders, reads, and writes numbers of any size, you can actually say, well, you know, people who can do that probably a fair way along that line and can actually do the things underneath them. So you start to write your curricula in terms of outcomes, we call those, if you want to, performance standards, whatever. And then the teacher's job is to track the student through there. I'll give you another example. The next one is problem solving. Yep. So if we think about problem solving, you can say, well, what does growth in problem solving look like? Well, at one level down the bottom, people are just starting to come to grips with problems. They don't even know they're facing a problem. They look at it and just sit there and don't know what to do about it. So you say, well, that child who responds that way is really down this left-hand end. How do I help them move along that line? Whereas if you look at the other end, further along the line, a student, when they see a problem, can actually suggest different ways of tackling that problem and come up with ways that you haven't thought of yet. And so, you know, that's what we do. We try and map out what growth looks like, and then we give the children the opportunity to prove to us what they can do. And then on the basis of that evidence, we can say they're there at the second point or they're at the third point. And so we're starting to track them along this developmental continuum, and these descriptions here we call performance standards. So if I go back now, so if I've got that developmental approach there, how do I know where the students are? How can I track them? Well, you give them questions. You ask them in class questions. You give them, you give them examination. You give them standardized tests. You do classroom tests, and so all the things we're talking about. And what you do is you put questions on there which enable the students to demonstrate growth. So, like that first question there in mathematics, if a student can add 2 plus 2, chances are they're just starting off in mathematics. A more challenging question would be 17 plus 29 or whatever. You can see that requires more mathematics knowledge to do than 2 plus 2. And the next one, 76 minus 29, requires more mathematics knowledge than the one before, and so on. So what you have to do really is you've got to start to think about what growth looks like, and then you kind of build questions which enable the students to give you evidence about where they are on that line. But you already have a fair idea. You know that a lot of your students won't be able to do 76 minus 29. Some will. And that's the point. You've got to give them a chance. Some will. And then you say, wow, they're a bit further on than I thought. I better keep working with them in this way, and so on. And of course, I just put that there, but this goes on for life. You know, that when I said about where people on that developmental continuum, I asked the question, you know, I say this is where they start, and then you show progress, and students go back and forward and whatever. And we've done research which showed that students actually learn not in a linear way, but in a sawtooth way. They have, you know, that's growth spurts, we call them, etc. But it's lifelong, and eventually, when you get older, you start to not do as well, so you can't do as much, whatever, and then it stops. And of course, that's the day that probably we die, and so we've got lifelong learning. But this continuum goes on. The integral of sine x minus 1 to n is just an extension. You could give that to your primary students. Some of them may know, I don't know. But unless you give them a chance to do something, you'll never know anything. So, you know, the sorts of ways this modern assessment theory manifests itself in the classroom says I've got to use multiple bits of information, not just based on a single test, but just let's confirm we've talked about that. You've got to make sure that your assessments are fit for purpose, that you actually do write good quality tests. And this links in with that the IDAT test and the reviews we did. We've got to make sure we've got some cases where tests have actually been reviewed. Are they really assessing this and so on? Because that's another bit of information. If it challenges my image, I've got to look at my own assessment or was that test appropriate for these students, etc. So it's all part of the teaching and learning process. You've got to make sure that in your test, you give them a chance where items go from easy to hard, unless, you know, for the purpose is to identify people for a select group, which means you only use hard items. If you want to find people who've got weaknesses, diagnostic tests, they only use easy. But if you want to find where students are, you've got to give them a chance. You've got to put some questions in there which aren't content specific, but which will enable those students who do have some extra ability to demonstrate they have. So you can say, wow, I'm going to do something with that child. That child's just demonstrated, I didn't know. So it affects the way we think and the way we teach. Construct marking rubrics, based on cognitive functioning. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Use standards to describe student performance and demonstrate growth. I did notice the IDAT has standards associated with it where it goes, you know, from the lower standard, it puts a description to the high standard, which is good because it says students at this level can do these sorts of things, which is the thing we're talking about. And you understand in the classroom this whole idea of monitoring growth. Okay, thank you. So your task in this model is you've got to think about your assessments, think about the tests you're going to pick, etc. Think about the purpose. And then what you've got to do is you've got to think about giving the students some questions, items, tests, whatever, observing them with tasks, and the question, etc., that you give them has to be designed in a way which is going to provide you with evidence against the curriculum, against the thing you're trying to measure. It provides you with evidence about where the child is located on that journey, along that developmental continuum. So if you write poor questions, then you're not really getting a true reflection of where the student is on that image. You need to make sure that you do fewer formal tests, but have good quality items when you do, so that you get a good image. It's really telling you something about about that thing you're trying to measure. And we call that validity, really. That's it. Is the question, the task that you've given the student, is it really going to indicate where they are on that developmental continuum? Okay. I think it's, I do want to kind of push this developmental continuum a bit further in the next 10 minutes or so. It isn't just the difficulty. Further to the right doesn't mean they can do harder questions. It really is a thinking issue. So let me give you an idea. If I asked everybody in this group what the formula for coffee is, chances are nobody will give it to me. I don't know. You may. If we're in a room, I'd probably ask you and see. And therefore, we think that's a really hard question. And you're right, because nobody knew it. The number of people who get a question right, and the total number gives you an idea of the difficulty. The fewer get it right, the harder it is. But that isn't what distinguishes growth. Because once I tell you that, once I tell you the formula for coffee, you'll remember it for life. It's not something that shows growth. And so what you were talking about, what distinguishes moving further along that continuum is not the difficulty of the items, but the cognitive depth. And I'll go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. These are just things I'm not going to go through, but if I've given you ideas. You can change the difficulty of an item fairly easy. You can change the vocabulary, you can look at the familiarity of the content, you can put a diagram in that makes it easier. You can go to the next slide. If you change the if you change a math question and go from 234 plus 179 horizontally, you'll find out that'll be harder for children than if you put it over 234 plus 179 on top of each other. You can try it if you want to, but it is harder. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the cognitive level. And the cognitive level refers to the complexity of the thought process required to correctly answer the item. Okay? What do I need to do? What does a student need to do to answer this item? And and the way we define that is to actually, we've got some models to define it, which tell us, is it just recall that I'm asking, or is it something more complex, or I've got to do something with the knowledge? And there are a whole pile of hierarchies which tell us that. One of those hierarchies you've probably heard about is Bloom's taxonomy. So we can skip to the next slide. Thank you. Go to the next one. Yeah, that's Ben Bloom there. And what Bloom did, he kind of mapped out a sort of a developmental continuum. He kind of implied it as stagnant, which it isn't. But you know, he said, look, the way you've got to differentiate in learning in some way. So just asking students to recall knowledge all the time is not actually going to help them grow. What we want to do is ask them to recall knowledge, then apply that knowledge to be able to use it to develop new knowledge, which is creation, to use it to be able to evaluate something, to use it to analyze a problem, put up some hypotheses, etc. So he said, you know, knowledge goes from what we call lower order thinking skills to what we call higher order thinking skills. We have to be able to write our questions to enable the students to demonstrate higher order thinking skills, because that move goes to the right on our developmental continuum. That we have to create these, we have to give them an opportunity, we have to find out there, and what characterizes those people working with higher order is that they use knowledge to solve problems, to compare and contrast things, to debate, to think logically, and so on. That's where we want to go. So as an example, I've just given an example there of Bloom's taxonomy. If you want to do something in respiration, if you ask students to define respiration, list the functions, etc., that's just recall. They know that, or they don't know it. But if you have to devise a plan suitable, the last one there, suitable to your living, that will enable you to have a healthier respiratory system, then you have to use that knowledge that you should have. You have to be able to apply it. You have to be able to break it up and think about it a bit more, and then come up with a solution which is fit for your purpose, you know, which the teacher may not even have thought of. And that's where we want our students to be able to create knowledge, to be able to create new things all the way along. And by the way, it doesn't start at kindergarten and say, well, kindergarten, I'm going to do knowledge, etc. Children at kindergarten should be given the opportunity to demonstrate that they can think creatively, etc. Okay, next slide. So I set out in this presentation here, you know, during the day to just introduce you in 45 minutes. That's a pretty quick introduction to the notion of assessment. And I wanted to, because I think we all have to be on the same page when we start to talk about these terms, I introduced you to that, and I talked about some of the key terms, testing, evaluation, etc. I could talk about formative assessment. It all fits our idea of assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment, and so on. I introduced you to the concept of a student image or profile. And you know, it really does say, and most of you may already do this, but it does say, you know, the image is the critical part to teaching. Every bit of evidence I get from all different sources, and it's coming in all the time, not just numbers, observation of students doing things, how they behave, all fits in. Talking to their parents can have an impact. And it's the reconciliation of the evidence that you're picking up, the data you're picking up constantly about students, It's that evidence and how it fits the image that drives your teaching. If they're doing something, if they're really doing really well and they do an IDAT test and they do really poorly, it isn't that they've done poorly on the test. The question is why? I just didn't expect that. Why is that happening? And that enables you to do more forensic analysis about the child, because when you can find out why that's happening, then you can tell, well, that's it. If I can fix that up, they can move further along the line. Making that explicit, letting people know that's how we use scores is really important. And similarly, formative assessment fits in there. You know, the observation, the thing they do in the class, take it in with the image. It isn't something that's out there, it's something. So teaching and learning and assessment fit together all the time. In fact, I can't differentiate between them. I introduced the notion of a developmental continuum and the idea of monitoring growth. And I think this shouldn't be new to you, but it may be formalized what you do, because this theory is built around what teachers do. I talked about the components of modern assessment theory and how they manifest themselves in the classroom fairly quickly. I've looked at the difference between item difficulty and cognitive depth. And I think that's the last one's the real challenge. Being able to write questions which really get the student to demonstrate they are really working at a higher level. Our tendency in class is to write questions. I taught that. Here's my test. How have the students gone on what I've taught? And that isn't it. It actually is, I've taught this information. I'm going to give them some questions which they haven't seen before, some problems. Ask them to create something that there may not be an answer to. I'm happy to have them go out and use the internet, whatever, but on the basis of that, I'm going to see from their responses whether they are demonstrating what we would consider higher order thinking. If they are, then they've moved along the line. How do I now teach them? If they're not, if they're still back at just being able to use knowledge and apply it, how do I get them to move to the next stage? So this idea of helping individuals as best you can, or groups, to move along is critical to the teaching and learning process. I've also put there for you the next slide. I've just put some readings there as if you want to read a bit more. Some of these talk about assessment. Very few do on modern assessment theory, but the concept of using data, collecting data appropriately and using it permeates all these readings. If you want to have a little bit look a bit further. Okay, I think that's 45 minutes, if I'm not wrong.
Very well done, Jim. Very to time. I'm just going to pop in for a second and just reference back to the IDAT and what Jim has had to say before we open up for questions. And Jim talked about building that image or the profile of the student. And he also talked about the standardized testing. And really what IDAT has tried to do is create that profile for a beginning student. So a student who is new to your school, so you know where they are on that developmental continuum, and then you can help to guide them to move further to the right or further out from that star. And because Jim mentioned that, you know, like a star with all of their skills, we're doing mathematics, English, you know, empathy, all of the kind of different things that both the academic and the personal development, and attempting to give you a complete profile of the student who's beginning with you, so that you know where they are on that continuum. Because if we consider they probably don't start at zero, then it tells you where they are already, so that you can guide them further in that learning, and to tell you where they would need support more to help them along that pathway. And I really think that that's how the IDAT and the modern assessment theory fit together for your teachers to use for the next steps for student learning. So I would like to open it up now to see if there are any questions for Jim. Please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat if you prefer.
Good morning, CEMA. Heidi.
Hello, Heidi.
Hi, I'm sorry, I probably won't turn on my camera because I'm still going to bed here. Thank you very much for this very knowledgeable information sharing. So for my work, I deal with a lot of international students, and I really agree. So when we're accepting new students, especially from another country, most of the time we lack of image, or we don't really know the student. So my question really is, so for a student coming from a very different background, so how the test or the theory applies to, this type of students. So when we sort of getting to know students from another country, what are the qualities you think will be more important for teachers to focus on?
So you get nothing from the other country? Do you get a report or?
Well, yes, that's the thing. So we normally just get a report, a piece of paper. So we don't really have any other information, like lively information about the student. So we use interview process, but I think that a very short 20 minutes doesn't represent the whole of a student. So I think that probably the strength and part of IDAT, and I really like it, but I'm not sure how that worked out for us to use the report or the test itself.
Well, I think the point that I'm making here is that, and I agree with you, by the way, 20 minutes isn't enough time to collect things about the whole student, but you do collect some information. You've got that report. If you can read the report or get somebody to read and see, does this say they're a really good student, an average student, poor student? When you talk to them, you will build up an image. Even talking to parents, you get an idea. I mean, you use all sorts of techniques to get a basic image, very thin. The IDAT gives you your first solid bit of information, okay? And by then, you would have actually thought, if they haven't, you would have, but from the image, you would say, if they do this IDAT, I would expect them to do very well because all this evidence is that. So again, you use it in a predictive way. You use it with the other information you've got. If you've got absolutely nothing, it's a starting point. Okay, this says students done pretty well. So when I start to give them work in class, I would expect them to do well or better than what they've done on the IDAT. So it's either part of an image, and it's a significant part because it should be confirming what you've already got in data, or it becomes the starting point. And again, it's quite a significant part because it says all my information now, I'm not just going to take it blind, I'm going to actually look at it in terms of how they went on the IDAT. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's built in to that idea. And we know that the more evidence we get from more sources, the more confident we are in our teaching and learning. And I think
I thought I'd just share an example of a test results page, and I've covered up the students' information, but to demonstrate what Jim's talking about, that this is the information that you get from the IDAT, and then you decide how to use this in your own school and how it applies to what you're looking at in terms of your assessment and helping the student to grow. So he mentioned that using a standardized norm. Now, IDAT has somewhat had to create their own, and we have based that on the 4 different curricula of the US, UK, the ACARA, and the Ontario curriculum, and basically assumed that a student who could do 80% of the can-do outcomes from the years before is a student who will function well and perform well in the classroom. And anything under that 80%, we have indicated how much support we think that they would require. As Jim mentioned, though, this is an interpretation, and your school will have to use this as fits your teachers and your teaching and learning situation. And that interview is also available through this, where you can look at the student interacting. And I'm sorry that the volume will not share in this example, but just I wanted to give you a little picture of what the results of the IDAT look like and how it is a piece of this modern assessment puzzle. It's not the only answer, of course, but it is a piece of that puzzle.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I answer your question, Heidi?
It was Sandra who asked it.
whoever asked the question, forgotten, was it?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Are there any other questions out there this morning?
They're the groups I like. No questions.
I think it's the time of morning. I think most of us are on the first cup.
Either means I did a really good lecture or everybody was asleep. Yeah, but yeah.
I think the only thing that I'd like to ask you to share, Jim, is what you found in the process of the Sydney University Quality Review of the IDAT, and how you felt it helped with this developmental continuum. You know, if there's anything we haven't already mentioned.
No, I mean, I think the key point of what I've said today is that you have to questions that are written must be what we call valid. If you do not write and have good questions or get good data, etc., then you could be building up this image on a pile of rubbish, and that's a significant issue everywhere at the moment. You know, in Australia, we're kind of really focusing on building up the assessment literacy skills of our teachers because we need good quality data. So if you have a test, like a standardized test or a sort of test that Heidi's, the IDAT, it's really important that those questions are reviewed to make sure if the question is written to say it's assessing this outcome at this level and it's this far along the developmental continuum, etc., then that item really has to give you an example of something that's it's fit for purpose. It really is assessing what it's supposed to be assessing at the appropriate level it's supposed to be assessing it. So IDAT went through a process. We had some of our item, Michelle Davidson actually went through them. She's been in charge of test development, ACR, Pearson, etc. Went through everyone and checked the item from what we call a subject matter point of view. Is it really assessing that outcome it's supposed to be assessing? A technical point of view, is it technically correct? Are there problems? Are there problems with the answers, etc.? And from an editorial point of view, because you don't put a question in front of somebody where it's got editorial errors in it, because the kids get distracted by it, and that doesn't show you where they really are. So that's the process of review, and that's one of the things that adds to what you've got. You should have confidence that the test that's being used for the purpose that you want has been through a process to make sure it's giving you what it's supposed to be giving you. And I think that's what Heidi and IDAT came to the University of Sydney for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. I will just quickly see if there are any other questions, and if not, we might wrap things up.
If people think of a question, want to send me an email, Heidi, or copy you.
Yes, and we will be sending the recording of this out to everyone, so everyone who registered, so whether or not they woke up this morning to get it. I do know I had someone from the Middle East who was considering getting up at midnight, and I don't think she's here, so I think that I will be sending that to her. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your time and for coming out today, and special thank you to Jim, who's taken time out of his very busy schedule to share this information with us. And if you do have any further questions about this or the IDAT and how we work within the modern assessment theory, we look forward to hearing from you. And again, thank you for your time, and have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Lovely to meet you, talk to you. Bye.